Welcome to a quick discussion of Final Fantasy IV Advance. In honor of the final Pixel Remaster's release, I wanted to highlight one of my favorite classic Final Fantasy games. Final Fantasy IV is an interesting game to me, and is an interesting game in general, actually. It was actually the second Final Fantasy released internationally, because 2 and 3 weren't released outside of Japan until much later. So in North America, this game was actually originally known as Final Fantasy II. It also wasn't released in Europe at all until the PS1 version, which was included with Final Fantasy V. The PS1 version in North America was actually included with Chrono Trigger, which is kind of a weird collection. But it actually makes a bit of sense in terms of how both games play. Final Fantasy IV was the first classic Final Fantasy game I tried, as far as I remember. The first Final Fantasy game I played in general was actually Final Fantasy XIII, which is actually considered one of the most infamous games in the series. But I actually really enjoyed it because I had nothing to compare it to. I enjoyed it so much that, like with a lot of series around that time, I kind of hyperfixated and tried a bunch of different games in the series that were immediately available at the time. So that includes the GBA versions of 1 and 2, Final Fantasy X on PS2, and of course the DS versions of Final Fantasy 3 and 4. I can't say that was a great starting point for the classic Final Fantasies, because Final Fantasy IV DS is actually known for being exceedingly difficult, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. Another interesting thing about Final Fantasy IV is it's the first game in the series to use the active time battle system. So instead of a traditional turn-based JRPG, we have these little bars that fill up, and whenever they're full, then we can perform an action. In general, for the time, Final Fantasy IV was incredibly unique. It's actually less unique now because it sort of was the basis of the next, 5 Final Fantasies in terms of overall structure and gameplay, but at the time this was really novel. One other unique feature in this game is how the story is set up. Compared to some of the earlier games, this game has a greater emphasis on its story and characters, and even though it can feel a little bit shallow by today's standards, it is actually still pretty impressive for 1991. Another interesting thing is the North American version, Final Fantasy II, actually is fairly notorious for a couple reasons. One of the reasons is its translation is very unique because Nintendo at the time had very strict guidelines for content, so a lot of the darker themes and language had to be removed, leading to lines like "you spoony bard" instead of one character getting cussed out, basically. That line has actually survived every retranslation of the game because it's so iconic that no one has wanted to get rid of it. As far as I'm aware, it's even in the Pixel Remaster, because no one wants to, retranslate the line, because it'll be probably, it could be more accurate, but it would not be nearly as popular if they actually changed it out. So with the greater emphasis on characters, sort of like Final Fantasy II, actually, the NES Final Fantasy II, to be more specific, this game has fairly predetermined characters, so a lot of Final Fantasy games, 1 and 3 specifically, and then after this, Final Fantasy V would use this system, would have sort of very blank slate characters that you could basically customize to your liking. In Final Fantasy I, you can basically choose starting classes, and then basically unlock new abilities and different classes from there. Final Fantasy III and V take it a step forward with the job system where you can actually switch classes periodically. So as you progress through the story, you can unlock more classes and kind of swap between them on the fly as you need them. 2 and 4 and 6 are a little bit more straightforward and character-driven with preset characters and everything. So for example, right now we have 2 characters in our party, Cecil, a Dark Knight who is on a path of redemption, and we have Rydia, who is a summoner, and basically Cecil's trying to protect Rydia because he was sort of indirectly responsible for the death of her mother, so that's one of the things he's trying to find redemption for. In general, the characters are actually pretty alright for a game from 1991. They're not exactly the most exciting Final Fantasy characters, but for a Super Famicom game, it's pretty impressive. One problem with this game, well, one thing that's actually not necessarily a problem, but can be a problem, is with the emphasis on characters, you kind of have a variety of characters rotating in and out of the party at one time, which leads to some interesting situations. So for example, you start the game with Cecil and Kain, who is another member of the Dark Knights. He's actually a Dragoon, more specifically, but he's on a similar power level to Cecil. So since Rydia is a small child at this point in the game, she's level 4, she's considerably weaker than Cecil, so it's kind of an Earthbound situation where you end up getting a character who's like exceedingly underleveled, and that can be difficult in terms of trying to survive, especially with some of the game's like random events. So for example, there are different states of battle, so you can obviously have a preemptive strike, but you can also get ambushed. And there's also row systems, so basically you have a front row and a back row depending on which position a character is in on the menu. So for example, like the top slot, the third slot, and I think the final slot is for the front row, and then the second and fourth slots are for the back row. You can also swap between them like this, but basically there are back attacks, so you can actually have the rows swapped automatically in battle, which kind of sucks in this case where Rydia is like so underleveled. So another problem with this is a lot of characters come and go in the story. So I feel like this is definitely a Final Fantasy where you probably shouldn't get too attached to any of the characters because, yeah, the story actually goes in some interesting directions. And in general, I do like that, but it does create problems where some of the characters I feel like don't get a whole lot of time to shine in the story. But basically, like, Cecil's your main character, he's like always in the party, as far as I remember. But yeah, basically a lot of the other characters rotate out. So at this point in the story, we are currently trying to help out Rosa, who is Cecil's love interest, who is currently dealing with desert fever, so we need to collect the Sand Ruby from an antlion den. So yeah, and then eventually Rosa will join the party along with a ton of other characters, and again, a lot of the characters come and go throughout the story. I actually can't remember how that works in terms of levels, like for example, if a character leaves and comes back, like what level do they come back at? I actually don't remember that, because some RPGs around this time definitely struggled with that, and would basically reintroduce a character and they would be at the exact same level and you'd have to level grind again. But yeah, you might notice that Rydia's ATB gauge is filling up much more slowly than Cecil's. She also has almost no defense because she's level 4, so she definitely needs to stay in the back row. Also, her physical attacks are going to be worse because she's in the back row, so she's mostly going to rely on magic. But yeah, like in Earthbound, you might have to spend some time level grinding just because of how underleveled certain characters are. So another interesting thing in the North American version is because it was one of the first Final Fantasy games released internationally, it was actually made a lot easier. In Japan, there were two versions. There was Final Fantasy IV Original, and then there was Final Fantasy IV Easy Type, which was slightly easier, as the name would imply, and then the North American version would take it a step further and be even easier, to my knowledge, to make it even more accessible for a new audience. They really wanted to make Final Fantasy an international success, and their solution to the problem was just make it really, really easy, hence why they released Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, which was a spin-off designed to be extremely easygoing and beginner-friendly, often to a fault. I'm pretty sure that was also the first Final Fantasy Europe got, until Final Fantasy VII. And then basically all the old games would be re-released in Europe whenever they would be re-released on like PlayStation or like Game Boy and things like that. Final Fantasy IV has also been re-released a ton of times. Like Final Fantasy 1 and 2, it also received a WonderSwan color port based on the PS1 version. This was only in Japan because the WonderSwan itself was only in Japan. Then that version was the basis of this version, the GBA version, which in a lot of ways is still a pretty good way to play this game. It was basically, based on the PS1 WonderSwan versions, but also has some additional content, like an additional dungeon, which would be retained for a few more re-releases and then removed for the Pixel Remaster, which was trying to be more faithful to the Super Nintendo version. After the GBA version, there was the DS remake around 2007, which again was my first version. This is actually a very different version. It actually uses like 3D character models, sort of a chibi art style, comparable to the Final Fantasy III remake. It also had voice acting for the characters, which honestly works pretty well because this is one of the more character-driven Final Fantasies. And they had a pretty good voice cast, too. It was also very difficult. So, like, ironically, with the North American Super Nintendo version being, like, weirdly easy compared to the original Japanese version, then you have the DS version that is exceedingly difficult. A lot of the bosses have been actually retooled with new strategies. So I would definitely recommend not starting with it and basically playing like one of the 2D versions of the game first, and then if you really enjoy it, maybe then consider playing the DS remake, because it's sort of like a different spin on the same like story, basically. So it is a cool interpretation, but definitely not the best starting point. With me starting with Final Fantasy XIII and 4DS, it's almost surprising I was able to stick with the series now that I think about it. And also the DS version was released on iOS, Android, and Steam, but that version actually adds in difficulty options. So hard mode in the Steam and iOS versions is closer to the DS's default difficulty to my knowledge, and then there's a new normal mode that's a lot more manageable. So if you were to play it, that would definitely be the way to go. Unlike other Final Fantasy, other classic Final Fantasies that were delisted when the Pixel Remasters dropped, to my knowledge, the Final Fantasy 3 and 4 3D remakes, as they're called, are still available on Steam and iOS. But like the PSP versions of 1 and 2 on iOS were delisted, and the Steam versions of 5 and 6 were delisted, which, depending on who you ask, isn't the biggest deal, because those were actually very unpopular versions of the game, to put it mildly. So yeah, in general, there's no shortage of ways to play Final Fantasy IV, and if you have never played a Final Fantasy game before and are interested in the franchise, this is not a bad starting point, as long as you stay far away from the DS version. Unless you like really difficult RPGs, in which case maybe you should start with the DS version. Maybe it wouldn't be as big of a deal, but yeah, someone starting out with the genre practically, it wasn't the best fit for me, but I got through it and I still enjoyed it. I looked up a lot of guides because I needed a ton of help to get through some of the bosses in that game, but I did eventually enjoy 4 quite a bit. And I still really like the story and characters, even though I do feel like the DS version's presentation is a bit hit or miss. Some of the graphics for like the in-game character models are a bit rough around the edges, because they're like DS level, like 3D graphics, so they're not like super, like expressive at times, but in general I do feel like the story is still pretty well told in that version. So Rydia is already up to level 7, which isn't bad. This is definitely a problem with old RPGs having to level grind quite a bit. In that way I get the intention of making the game easier internationally to make it a little bit less tedious. But from what I gathered, the original Super Nintendo version took it a step too far and made it way too easy. Eventually I would like to play the original Final Fantasy II, just to see what it's like, to see just how easy it is. As someone who started with the DS version, it would actually be very fascinating to see just how easy it is. I think it was released on Virtual Console. Obviously that doesn't really help nowadays, sadly. Wii Virtual Console more specifically. And as of now, the Pixel Remasters are only available on Steam and iOS. They are not available on console yet. But it's heavily rumored that once 6 releases, this is being recorded before 6 releases. I don't know if it'll be out by the time this video goes live, but it's rumored that whenever all of the Pixel Remasters are available on Steam and iOS, then eventually they'll be moved over to console, where I'll probably play them. I generally prefer playing games on console to PC or mobile, so I've been kind of holding out for a PC release, or not a PC, a console release. Hopefully they fix the font though, because that is one of the biggest issues, specifically with the mobile version. With the Steam version, you can actually mod the game and fix the really tiny text size and narrowness, but obviously on mobile or console that would be a lot more difficult. So I hope by the time these games release on console, they do make the font a little bit more readable by default without having to go into the files and mod it. That would be the one benefit of playing the PC version, is modding capabilities. And also, one other re-release of the game is the PSP version, Final Fantasy IV The Complete Collection, which includes a new interlude, and the WiiWare game, Final Fantasy IV The After Years, which was a sequel, an episodic sequel that, from what I gather, was not very good, and if you don't get to play it because it's basically limited to like WiiWare and the PSP re-release, you're not really missing out on much, from what I gather. It's not very good. Also, the PS1 version is available, I think, on the PS3 store, but that version isn't great because it has really long load times. As someone who has the Final Fantasy V PS1 version, I can attest to how bad the load times are in the PS1 re-releases of those games. So yeah, if you want to play 4, I would definitely recommend either the Pixel Remaster. Also, the Pixel Remaster has like reworked sprites and also recorded music, and the soundtracks of the Pixel Remasters, as divisive as the actual graphics are, the soundtracks are amazing, so that's one thing to consider. But you are missing out on the GBA content, which is included in the GBA, DS, and PSP versions. And also probably the Steam version, since it's based on the DS version. So yeah, there are plenty of ways to play this game, including the 3D remake and more of a traditional experience with the Pixel Remasters. And I would recommend this game. I like it a lot. It isn't my favorite Final Fantasy. I definitely prefer 9, 10, and 6 to this, but this is still pretty solid. But on that note, I think that's about all I have to say about this game, so thank you for watching, and I hope you'll join me next time for another discussion.